Think about the last time anger took over your body. Your chest tightened, your thoughts turned dark, and for a few terrible seconds, you were no longer the person you want to be. You were someone sharper, less controlled, harder to recognize. And when it passed, maybe you felt relief, or maybe you felt shame, or maybe both. Here is something most people never learn. Anger is not just an emotion. It is a pattern one the mind learned over years. And, like any pattern, it can be unlearned. The ancient Stoics cracked this code more than 2,000 years ago. They did not just manage anger. They completely transformed their relationship with it. And in this video, I am going to walk you through exactly how they did it, and exactly how you can too. Stay with me, because this might be the most important thing you give your attention to today. Number 1, how anger hijacks your life. Anger has a voice that sounds exactly like reason. That is the first thing you need to understand about it. When it rises inside you, it does not announce itself as a problem. It announces itself as truth. It tells you that you are right, that you have been wronged, that the fury burning through your veins is completely and absolutely deserved. And because it feels so certain, so justified, we believe it. We act on it, and then we spend days, sometimes years, cleaning up what it left behind. Seneca, one of the greatest Stoic minds of the ancient world, wrote extensively about anger and called it the most hideous and frenzied of all the emotions, not because it makes people loud or volatile, but because it convinces them they are thinking clearly when their judgment has already completely collapsed. He described a person in the grip of anger as resembling someone who has lost their mind, not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in a quiet and certain way. They believe they are seeing the situation accurately. They are not. They are seeing a distortion built entirely from their own emotional state. Here is what is actually happening inside you when anger ignites. The moment your brain perceives a threat, whether real or imagined, a small structure deep in your brain fires an immediate alarm. Stress hormones flood your body within seconds. Adrenaline surges, cortisol rises, your heart rate climbs, and your breathing shallows. And crucially, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational judgment, long-term thinking, and sound decision-making, is effectively bypassed. You are no longer reasoning, you are reacting. The thoughtful, measured person you are in calm moments has temporarily stepped aside, and something older and faster has taken the wheel. The Stoics had a name for this moment. They called it the first movement, the automatic physical and emotional reaction to a trigger, the surge of heat, the tightening jaw, the flood of indignation. And they were honest enough to admit that this first movement is largely beyond our control. The body reacts before the mind can intervene, but what the Stoics also identified, and this is where their philosophy becomes genuinely life-changing, is that following the first movement there is a second, and that second movement is everything. That is the choice of what to do with the fire that has just been lit inside you. Most people live their entire lives responding only from the first movement. They feel anger and they act on anger, and then they spend the remainder of their day, or sometimes the remainder of their relationships, managing the consequences of a decision made in a fraction of a second. The Stoics teach us something more important, that between the trigger and the response, there exists a space. However small that space may feel, inside it lives your dignity, your wisdom, and your freedom. Anger also costs far more than most people acknowledge. Every episode of serious anger stresses your cardiovascular system. It impairs cognitive function for hours afterward. It erodes trust in relationships, not just in the moments of explosion, but in the slow accumulation of tension and distance that follows them. And most painfully, it pulls you out of the present moment entirely. Every minute spent burning inside anger is a minute that cannot be spent building anything that actually matters to you. The Stoics were not asking us to pretend anger does not arise. They were asking us to understand clearly what it takes from us every single time we give it our full surrender. Number 2, The practice of self-examination. The Stoics were consumed by a single question that most of us are too busy or too afraid to ask ourselves with genuine honesty. That question is, who do I actually become when life pushes me toward my edge? Not who I present myself to be, not who I intend to be, but who I genuinely am in the moments when the pressure is highest and the instinct to react is loudest. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome and one of the most dedicated Stoic practitioners who ever lived, kept a private journal for much of his adult life. He never wrote it for an audience. It was never intended to be read by others. It was simply the record of a man holding himself to honest account, a daily discipline of examining his own failures, his own patterns, and the ongoing gap between the person he was and the person he was trying to become. What makes his journal remarkable is not its wisdom, though it is deeply wise. What makes it remarkable is its honesty. He does not spare himself. He names his irritations, his impatience, his moments of weakness, and then he asks how he might do better tomorrow. Self-examination in the Stoic tradition is not about guilt or self-punishment. It is about accuracy. It is the practice of developing enough honest self-knowledge to see your own patterns clearly, to understand not just what you did, but why you did it, and not just what triggered your anger, but what the trigger was actually touching underneath. Because here is what honest self-examination almost always reveals. Anger is a surface emotion. Beneath it, without exception, there is something more vulnerable. Fear of being disrespected, fear of losing control, fear of not being heard or valued or taken seriously. The colleague who interrupted you in a meeting did not merely interrupt you, they activated a need to be recognized. The friend who canceled plans without warning did not merely change your evening, they brushed an old wound about being deprioritized. Understanding this does not excuse the triggering behavior, but it completely changes your relationship with your own reaction, because you are now responding to what is actually there rather than what the surface emotion is advertising. The practice is simple, but it requires real commitment. Each evening, give yourself 5 minutes of honest review. Where did I react instead of respond today? What fear or need was underneath my frustration? What would I have chosen if I had a single extra second to decide? This is not an exercise in shame. This is the patient and consistent work of building self-knowledge deep enough that genuine change becomes possible. You cannot change what you cannot see, and you cannot see clearly what you have never taken the time to examine. Number 3, the power of the pause. Between every trigger and every response, there is a moment. It may be very small, barely larger than a heartbeat. But inside that moment lives one of the most transformative abilities a human being can develop, the ability to pause, to not react immediately, to create a sliver of space between what has just happened and what you are about to do about it. The Stoics did not simply know about this space. They trained themselves to inhabit it deliberately and consistently as the cornerstone of their entire approach to emotional mastery. Epictetus, who spent years of his life enslaved and could not control a single thing about his external circumstances, built his entire philosophy around this insight. He taught that between what happens to us and how we respond to it, our freedom lies. Not the freedom to change every situation he knew that was impossible, but the freedom to decide who we are going to be within every situation. This is an active, disciplined, practiced freedom. It belongs to people who have trained the pause into themselves so thoroughly that it becomes instinctive, the natural first response to any provocation rather than an effortful act of will. The pause looks different in different situations. In a heated exchange, it might mean 10 full seconds of genuine silence before responding. In a moment of rising frustration at home, it might mean leaving the room for a few minutes before re-engaging. In response to an infuriating message or email, it might mean closing the screen, moving your body briefly, taking several slow, deliberate breaths, and only then returning to craft a response you will not regret. The specific form matters far less than the function, creating enough distance between the trigger and your response that your rational mind can show up before your words or actions do. And what happens during that pause is neurologically genuine. The initial surge of stress hormones that came with the anger trigger begins to metabolize. The brain's alarm signals slowly quieten. The rational, forward-thinking parts of your mind gradually reassert themselves. The situation that seemed impossible a moment ago begins to look navigable. The words you felt you absolutely had to say begin to seem less necessary or sometimes completely unnecessary. What felt like a crisis starts to look like a problem, and problems have solutions. Think of the moments in your own life when you exercised the pause without even naming it, when you started to raise your voice and stopped, when you drafted something in anger and deleted it before it was sent, when you chose to walk away from an escalating conversation instead of feeding it. In every one of those moments, you were practicing exactly what Epictetus taught. And in almost every one of those moments, you were grateful later that you had. The pause is not suppression. It is simply the decision to let your best self arrive before your worst words do. Number 4, the discipline of silence. Modern life has become almost allergic to silence. Every gap in stimulation is instantly filled with notifications, with noise, with the constant low-grade pressure to be responsive and visible and engaged. And in this environment, our emotional lives have accelerated to match the pace. We feel something and express it immediately. We receive a provocation and respond within seconds. We have learned to live our emotional lives at a speed that leaves almost no room for reflection and therefore almost no room for wisdom. Epictetus was direct with his students about this. He told them that one of the most important disciplines they could practice was simply saying less, not because they had nothing to contribute, but because they had learned to place more value on the quality of what they said than on the quantity. He observed that the people who spoke every thought that crossed their minds were also the people most frequently in conflict, most easily destabilized, and most often regretting their own words the following morning. Choosing silence was not passivity for Epictetus. It was a form of power, the power of a person who decides what deserves a response and what does not. There is a specific kind of anger that thrives on escalation, on the momentum of two people locked in conflict, both certain of their own rightness, both too occupied with defending themselves to actually hear what the other person is saying. This anger cannot survive genuine silence. The moment one person in a confrontation makes the real choice to stop defending and start listening, not waiting impatiently for their turn to speak, but actually taking in what the other person is communicating, the entire energy of the situation changes. What felt like combat starts to feel like a conversation. What felt impossible starts to feel like something that might have a solution. Silence also serves as protection, specifically the protection of your future self from the destructive capacity of your present emotional state. When anger is elevated, the words that feel most urgent are almost always the words that will cause the most lasting damage. Words that reach for the other person's deepest insecurities. Words that cannot be taken back. Words that come not from wisdom but from the desperate need to be right, to be heard, to make the other person feel the same hurt you are feeling. The Stoic discipline of silence is the practice of protecting people you love from a version of yourself that you will not like in the morning. Marcus Aurelius wrote that he was always working to give less of his attention to what was unworthy of it. He applied this to speech as much as to anything else. When courtiers tried to draw him into arguments, petty disputes, and ego-driven confrontations, he practiced the discipline of not entering, not because he did not notice the provocation, but because he had decided that his attention, the most finite and valuable resource he possessed, would not be spent on noise. Stay with me now, because what comes next is where this philosophy stops being interesting and starts being genuinely transformative. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to say something sincerely. The fact that you are here right now, investing your time in understanding yourself more deeply, looking for a better way to navigate your inner life, already tells me something about who you are. You are someone who takes your growth seriously. If this video is speaking to you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who might need to hear this today. Every share sends these ideas towards someone who might genuinely be waiting for them. Now, let us go even deeper. Number 5, the art of gratitude. Gratitude and anger cannot occupy the same mind at the same time. This is not a motivational phrase. It is one of the most practically useful psychological insights the Stoics ever produced, and one that modern neuroscience has since confirmed from a completely different direction. When the mind is genuinely and actively focused on what it has, what is present, what is working, there is simply no room available for the resentment, the grievance, and the chronic sense of being wronged that feeds and sustains anger. Marcus Aurelius began each morning not with a strategy session or a review of what needed to be accomplished, but with a deliberate act of gratitude. Not the simple gratitude of appreciating pleasant things, though that has its place, but a deeper and more demanding gratitude. He would think about the difficult people he was going to encounter that day and remind himself that they, like him, were struggling with their own limitations and fears. He would consider the challenges ahead and recognize them as opportunities to practice the virtues he was committed to. He was training himself to approach even hard things with a kind of open acceptance rather than resentment. The Stoics extended this practice into something they called amor fati, the love of fate, the radical acceptance not just of what is good in life, but of everything, including difficulty, loss, conflict, and disappointment. Not a gritted teeth tolerance of hard things, but a genuine welcoming of them as part of the full texture of a life lived with eyes open. This does not mean pretending that pain is not painful. It means choosing to look even at pain and ask honestly, what does this have for me? What can this teach me that easier circumstances never could? In everyday terms, gratitude functions as one of the most reliable interruptions to the anger cycle. When you feel frustration beginning to build over something a person has done or something a situation has produced, deliberately redirecting attention toward what remains intact, what is still present, what has not been taken from you, creates an immediate and measurable shift. It resets the scale on which you are unconsciously measuring things. Something that registered as a catastrophe on a scale that forgot to account for everything good in your life looks entirely different when counted against the full picture. Give yourself this experiment for 1 week. Before your day begins, before you open your messages, before the first demand arrives, write down 3 genuine things you are grateful for and make yourself find new ones each day. Notice the quiet gifts that usually go completely unacknowledged. The fact that your body is doing, right now without being asked, the astonishing work of keeping you alive. The fact that someone in your life genuinely cares whether you are okay. The fact that today is another day that has not yet been written. These small and honest gratitudes, practiced daily, gradually shift the baseline of your mind from one that defaults to deficit toward one that is anchored in abundance. And a mind genuinely anchored in abundance is not a mind that stays angry for long. Number 6, accepting what cannot be changed. All of Stoic philosophy moves toward a single distinction, a line drawn between 2 categories that most people spend their entire lives blurring. On one side, everything within your power. Your choices, your responses, your character, your effort, the quality of attention you bring to this moment. On the other side, everything outside your power. Other people's choices, circumstances that arrive uninvited, the past, the behavior of strangers, the million things that happen in a world that does not consult your preferences before unfolding. Epictetus called understanding this distinction the very beginning of wisdom, and he was not being modest about its importance. A great deal of human anger lives directly inside this confusion. We become furious at things that were never within our power, at traffic, at other people's personalities, at plans that fell apart despite our best efforts, at outcomes that life produced without asking our opinion. and we spend extraordinary amounts of energy in the attempt to control what was never ours to control. Marcus Aurelius recognized this tendency in himself and wrote about it with unusual candor. How much pain is caused by demanding the impossible, not by what happens to us, but by the insistence that what happened should not have. Accepting what cannot be changed is not the same as passivity. The Stoics were among the most engaged and purposeful individuals in the ancient world. Marcus Aurelius led armies through decades of war. Cato stood against political corruption at personal cost. Seneca produced one of the most extensive bodies of philosophical writing in history. Their acceptance of fate was not an excuse to do nothing. It was the clarity that allowed them to do everything within their actual power without wasting energy on what was outside it. Look honestly at the situations in your life that have produced the most persistent anger. How much of that anger has been directed at things genuinely beyond your reach, the behavior of someone who will not change, a decision already made before you arrived, a moment from the past that cannot be undone? And what has that anger actually produced? Has it changed any of those things? Has it returned anything to you that was lost? Or has it simply consumed the energy, relationships, and inner peace that you would have greatly preferred to keep? Accepting what cannot be changed is not resignation. It is the single most efficient reallocation a person can make. Every hour reclaimed from fighting the uncontrollable is an hour returned to building, healing, creating, and improving the things that are genuinely yours to shape. When this acceptance truly takes root, not as a concept held at arm's length, but as a lived reality, something unexpected happens. The chronic background tension of grievance and frustration that most people have mistaken their whole lives for normal simply quiets. And in that quiet, you discover the clarity to see exactly where your energy actually belongs. Number 7, the freedom of forgiveness. We have arrived at the place where Stoicism asks the most of us and offers the most in return. Forgiveness. Not forgiveness as a social obligation or a religious performance. Not forgiveness offered to make someone else feel better about what they did, but forgiveness as an act of personal liberation, the deliberate decision to stop allowing someone else's past behavior to determine the quality of your present experience. The Stoics understood this with unusual precision. They knew that what looks like strength in resentment, the refusal to forgive, the maintenance of grievance, the careful nurturing of old wounds is, in reality, one of the most costly things a person can choose to do to themselves. Consider what it actually costs you to hold on to anger toward another person. Every time you revisit the memory of what they did, your body responds as though it is happening again right now. Stress hormones rise. Your nervous system activates. Your mood darkens. The incident may have occurred months or years in the past, and the person responsible may have moved on without giving it another thought. But you are still paying the price, still experiencing the cost, still carrying the weight not for their benefit but entirely at your own. The Stoics named this plainly. It is choosing to stay injured long after the original wound has been given. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal about people who had acted against him, who had tried to damage him, who had treated him with contempt. And he returned again and again to the same quiet conclusion. These people were doing what people like them do. Their limitations were simply human limitations. And choosing to remain in resentment toward them would cost him more than anything they had managed to take from him. Forgiveness, for Marcus Aurelius, was never a grand gesture directed at the other person. It was a daily, internal discipline directed entirely at himself, the consistent choice to not carry what he did not have to carry. What makes this Stoic framework for forgiveness genuinely workable is that it does not ask us to forget what happened, or to pretend the harm was not real, or to welcome back someone who has shown they will cause more harm, or to wait for the other person's apology, or their awareness that they have been forgiven. None of that is required. What it asks is simpler and harder than all of those things combined, that you decide the event, though real and though painful, will not continue to shape the present. that you withdraw the ongoing attention and emotional energy you have been directing towards something that is already finished, that you reclaim yourself fully. When you forgive someone, you are not releasing them from anything. In almost all cases, they do not need your forgiveness in any practical sense. They are already free. You are the one who has been imprisoned by your own continued investment in a story about what they once did. Forgiveness is simply the moment you choose to leave that prison. The moment you decide that your attention, your energy, and your inner life are too valuable to keep spending on a past that cannot be changed. Genuine forgiveness rarely arrives in a single dramatic moment. More often, it is a practice, a choice, made repeatedly across days and weeks, until one morning you notice that the memory no longer produces the familiar surge of bitterness, until you find you can think of the person who hurt you without the old heat. That is the moment of true freedom. Not because anything changed in the world outside you, but because something changed permanently in the world inside you. Life will always bring situations that feel unjust, people who cause real harm, moments when you were wronged in ways you genuinely did not deserve. The Stoics did not dispute this. They simply asked one question in response to all of it. Who do you want to be? Because who we are in response to the worst things that happen to us is, ultimately, who we truly are. And the person who can be genuinely hurt and still choose to release the anger, release the resentment, and release the need for the world to have been different, that person has achieved something no circumstance can take away. We have walked a long road together in this video. From the first ignition point of anger and what it actually does to your brain and body, through 7 practices the Stoics built and refined across centuries. Honest self-examination, the power of the pause, the discipline of silence, the art of gratitude, the acceptance of what cannot be changed, and finally the freedom that comes through forgiveness. These are not separate techniques to be picked up and put down when convenient. They are 7 expressions of a single truth, that you are not your emotions. You are the one who observes them, who chooses what to do with them, and who decides in every moment who you are going to be. Stoicism does not promise a life without anger. It promises something rarer and more enduring, a version of yourself capable of meeting anger without being ruled by it, a self that feels the fire and does not burn down what it has built. If this video has reached something true in you today, then this conversation does not have to end here. Every week at Stoic Site, we go deeper into these ancient truths, not as artifacts of a distant past, but as living tools for the lives we are actually living right now. Hit subscribe so you never miss one, because the work of becoming the person you are truly capable of being is the most important work there is, and it is never too late to begin.